people allowed to say anything or?
Yeah, I'll edit all this out
We
until it.
tape it now.
Yeah.
Do the
Yeah.
scan of everybody to prove that she had the people here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine if President Bush or President Obama wandered around town wearing a headdress, bedazzled sandals, and black eyeliner? Sounds pretty crazy, but about 5,000 years ago, that was the norm. According to Tara Clapper in her eHow.com article titled, "What Did the Ancient Egyptians Wear?" the pharaoh or the king wore a neme, which is the headdress, decorated sandals, and kohl, which is that black smudgy eyeliner. The most well-known and intriguing of these pharaohs of ancient Egypt, each of them having his or her own accomplishments and contributions, include King Tutankhamun, Queen Hatshepsut, and King Ramesses II, who is also known as Ramesses the Great. All my life I've been fascinated with ancient Egypt. Every time a documentary comes on, I have to watch it. And we even went to the Museum of Natural History in Denver, and we got to tour all of the Egyptian exhibits. We even saw a few mummies, so that was pretty cool, and it just really piqued my interest in ancient Egypt. And today I'm going to share with you the lives and some of the accomplishments of three of the most renowned pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Oh my gosh. What is this? Alright, so King Tutankhamun. We're going to start with him. On November 26, 1922, Howard Carter went on an excavation and he discovered one of the greatest finds of the 20th century, which is King Tut's tomb. According to the hieroglyphics and scrolls found inside the tomb, King Tut is believed to have ruled between 1334 and 1325 BC. He ascended to the throne at age 9 and married his half-sister, if you can believe it. In Jimmy Dunn's article titled King Tut on TourEgypt.net, they say he was so young and inexperienced that he actually had two handlers who basically ruled for him, because his father Akhenaten was believed to be a heretic and crazy, and they just wanted to get him off the throne. So that's how King Tut actually came to power. There's a picture of him right here. Now, pharaohs are valued based on their building and accomplishments. It doesn't matter how many battles you win, but if you build a lot of temples, then they say you were a great ruler. And this is true with King Tut, too. He actually built temples in Karnak and Luxor. Unfortunately, the guy who came right after him claimed all the buildings as his own. So this is why King Tut is actually not even included in any of the Egyptian history, like any of their annals. Now, there's a lot of controversy on King Tut's death. He died at the age of 18, and a few doctors have done some examinations, and they've shown that he had a sliver of bone in the back of his skull. So he may have been murdered. But then even more recently, they're saying it was probably an infection from a broken leg. Alright, well, now that we've gone through King Tut, let's start with Hatshepsut. She is actually a woman queen, and you probably know Cleopatra and Nefertiti, but Hatshepsut was a very, very famous woman pharaoh. She was the ruler of Egypt from about 1473 to 1458 BC. She actually was the wife of her half-brother, Thutmose II. And after his death, his son Thutmose III became pharaoh. And so she actually became, it was her stepson, but she became like a co-ruler with him. Hatshepsut administers the affairs of Egypt, and she built temples and reliefs to herself. She actually declared herself the wife of Emun, which is the king of the gods. And then she had the full support of the nation and the high priesthood with her. So she was very well liked, very well respected. She realized that she could become more powerful and more well liked if she ruled as a man. So she started stripping her titles of woman, or started stripping her women titles, and started dressing as a man, wore the man's headdress, wore the man's robe. It was pretty. In Caroline Seabright's article, Hatshepsut, Female Pharaoh of Egypt on TourEgypt.net, really explains that really well. Now in 1458, Thutmose III, realizing that he should be king, led a revolt, and that's the last we hear of her. She disappeared from history. So he probably murdered her, but we don't really know. and he destroyed all of her temples and all of her reliefs. Everything that she had built for herself, he got rid of. Now that we've gone through King Tut and Queen Hatshepsut, let's start with Ramesses II, as played by the famous Yul Brynner. You may have known him. There is actually a temple that he built to himself. He was known as Ramesses the Great, and he was undoubtedly the most famous of all pharaohs. He actually led a battle against the Hittites in Kadesh. The battle really wasn't that important at all, but the way Ramesses II described it, it was the mother of all battles, and he won it single-handedly, and he had this written on all of his temples. So he had a pretty big ego. And as John Ray on BBC.com says in his article, Ramesses the Great, he is the hieroglyphic equivalent of hot air. I thought that was pretty funny. Ramesses built more temples than any other pharaoh. He actually really vamped up the temple building process, and he really went for quantity over quality. Like I said, arrogant, large ego. He even built his own capital city, Pi-Ramesses. No other pharaoh in history had done that, and he named it after himself, which was unheard of. And as I mentioned, King Tut's father, Akhenaten, who was the heretic, the crazy guy, he didn't even do that. Only Ramesses II. And he sired 100 sons and 60 daughters. Had quite a few wives. Whenever he died, he was around 91 when he died, his son, who was actually the 13th in line to the throne, did an inventory of Egypt and their holdings and everything. He almost bankrupted the throne. Alright, so let's review what we have just discussed. We went over King Tut, King Tutankhamun, who was famous for basically being discovered in the 20th century. He really didn't do much, but it was just cool that he was discovered recently. Queen Hatshepsut, who was famous for ruling as a man, even though she was a woman. And then King Ramesses II, whose greatness we don't really even have to discuss because he knew he was great and everybody knew he was great. Now, the most intriguing and well-known pharaohs of Egypt are arguably, like I said, King Tut, Queen Hatshepsut, and King Ramesses II. And as I've discussed, each of these rulers became famous in his or her own right. Now, in his BBC.com article titled Ramesses the Great, John Ray says that, and I quote, "Modesty is not considered to be a pharaonic virtue. In fact, at the time, pharaohs were described as being descended from the gods or actually gods themselves." So it's really not that possible for a pharaoh to overdo it because they need to be great because they are supposed to be so great. And even though he almost bankrupted the throne, Ramesses is considered great. Now, if our leaders in Washington maybe wore headdresses, bedazzled sandals, and black eyeliner, maybe they would be considered great too, even if they bankrupt us. Thank you very much.
Tut.